The cemetery was quiet until a sharp male voice cut through the mist. "Why is a black woman touching my wife's grave?" Keisha froze, her hand still resting on the bouquet of bluebells she had just placed. The wind carried the chill straight through her coat. Behind her stood a tall white man in a charcoal trench coat. Ethan Cole, a billionaire whose face appeared on business magazines more often than in public. His gray eyes were cold steel. Beside him, a blonde woman clutched his arm, and a little girl peeked out from behind his leg, her pink hood bright against a gray day. Keisha turned slowly, heart pounding. "I didn't mean any harm," she said softly. "I just wanted to leave flowers." Ethan stepped closer. "You don't even know my wife." The woman beside him scoffed, voice dripping with contempt. Maybe she's one of those people who take pictures for sympathy clicks. Keisha's jaw tightened. "I don't take pictures of graves." The air thickened. The only sound was a rustle of leaves and the faint hum of passing cars beyond the iron gate. Then a small voice broke the silence. "Daddy," the little girl whispered, eyes wide and innocent. "She looks like Mommy." The word struck Ethan like a quiet explosion. His gaze flicked between the child and Keisha. The same shape of eyes, the same outline of the face. For a heartbeat, disbelief softened his anger. Keisha looked down at the flowers, bluebells trembling in the wind, and whispered, "I didn't choose them. They just felt right." The blonde woman tightened her grip on Ethan's arm. "Let's go." She's making things up. But Ethan didn't move. Something in Keisha's trembling hands told him this wasn't a coincidence. He spoke again, his tone low. "What's your name?" "Keisha Brown," she replied. Ethan hesitated. "And why this grave?" Keisha met his eyes. "Because I think the woman buried here might be my sister." Silence. Only the soft rain beginning to fall between them, and the sound of a truth neither of them yet understood. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. Keisha stood in her tiny Bronx apartment, rinsing the dirt and thorn scratches from her hands. The sting of cold water bit into her skin, but she welcomed the pain. It reminded her she was still alive, still searching for something she couldn't name. The cracked mirror above the sink showed a woman who looked strong, but tired. For a long moment, she just stared at her reflection. Brown eyes, full lips, and the faint scar on her chin she'd had since childhood. She whispered to herself, "Why her grave? Why now?" On the small table behind her lay a worn manila folder, her only proof that her life had ever existed before foster care. Inside, faded documents, a scribbled intake note from a long-retired social worker, and one fragile photograph. Two little girls, about 2 years old, sitting on a park bench, holding hands. On the back, in faded ink, Clara and Keisha, age 2. She brushed her fingers over the photo as if the paper might breathe. The resemblance was undeniable. The woman in the grave, Clara Cole, had her same eyes, her same smile. The same eyes that billionaire Ethan Cole's daughter had inherited. Keisha's thoughts spiraled back to that little girl's voice. "She looks like Mommy." It hadn't been rehearsed. Children didn't lie about faces. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from her coworker, Carmen. "You okay? You left work early." Keisha stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back, "Yeah, just chasing ghosts." She sat at the edge of her bed, rain tapping softly against the window. The bluebells she'd bought from the street vendor that morning were still on the counter, their petals drooping, scent fading. She whispered, "Why those flowers? I could have picked anything." But deep down, she already knew. Some part of her had always been drawn to them, as if memory carried through blood. Her heartbeat slowed. Resolve replaced fear. Tomorrow, she would go back, not to the cemetery, but to Ethan Cole's office. He wanted answers. So, did she? If this man was truly the husband of her sister, he was the only link to a family she never knew existed. And maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally set her free. The next day, Manhattan's skyline glimmered under pale morning light as Keisha stood outside Cole Industries Tower, a steel monument to power, wealth, and everything she'd never had. She tightened her grip on the manila folder and walked inside. The lobby smelled like citrus polish and quiet money. Behind the front desk sat a sleek woman in navy blue. Her smile was practiced, her tone clipped. "Do you have an appointment?" "Yes," Keisha said calmly, "with Mr. Ethan Cole." The woman hesitated, eyes flicking over Keisha's modest clothes. After a pause, she tapped her keyboard. "He's expecting you. Top floor." The elevator ride felt endless, a slow climb through invisible layers of judgment. When the doors opened, Victoria Hale was waiting. Blonde, elegant, and sharp as glass, she wore confidence like perfume. Her eyes skimmed Keisha from head to toe. "You're early," she said, voice sweet but heavy with sarcasm. "I like being on time," Keisha replied. Victoria smiled thinly. "Follow me." Ethan's office stretched across the entire floor, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city below. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, posture controlled, expression unreadable. When he turned, his tone was even. "Miss Brown, please sit." Keisha placed a folder on his desk and opened it with trembling fingers. "This is all I have," she said. The photo, intake records, and a note from a social worker who's long retired. "It's not much, but it's real." Ethan leaned forward, eyes fixed on the photo. 2 toddlers. Identical. He looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time without hostility. "You could be her reflection," he murmured. "Her name was Clara," Keisha whispered. "Yes," he said softly. "My wife." For a long moment, neither spoke. The city outside moved on, cars crawling like silver veins. Lives continued while there's pause on a single truth. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "She never mentioned having a sister." "Maybe she didn't know," Keisha replied. "Foster records say we were separated when we were 2. Separated by who? I don't know, but I intend to find out." Ethan straightened. "There's a way to know for sure." He opened a drawer, pulled out a small envelope, and slid it across the desk. "A DNA test. You, me, and my daughter, Ellie. If you're right, we'll have proof." Keisha hesitated, then nodded. "Whatever it takes." Victoria's voice cut in coldly from the corner. "Mr. Cole, with respect, this woman could be after anything, publicity, money." Ethan's tone sharpened. "That's enough, Victoria." He turned back to Keisha, voice steady. "Tomorrow noon. The clinic address is inside. I'll cover the cost." Keisha rose slowly. "Thank you." Ethan nodded once. "Don't thank me yet. Let's see the truth first." As she walked out, Victoria's whisper followed her like a shadow. "You don't belong in this world." Keisha paused, meeting her eyes. "Maybe not," she said quietly, "but I belong in my own story." She pressed the elevator button, heart pounding, knowing tomorrow might change everything. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and nerves. Keisha sat on a gray chair, fingers wrapped around her bag strap. Across from her, Ethan Cole scrolled through his phone, pretending to be calm. His daughter, Ellie, swung her little legs and held a worn stuffed elephant. For a moment, the 3 of them looked like a family that had simply misplaced its smile. The nurse called softly, "Miss Brown?" Keisha followed her into a small room where everything gleamed white and sterile. A cheek swab, a barcode sticker, a signature. Quick, clinical. Still, her chest felt heavy, not with fear, but with something deeper. What if I really am her sister? When she stepped back into the waiting area, Ethan rose with Ellie in his arms. They exchanged a nod, nothing more, but their eyes said everything words couldn't. They would wait. That night, Keisha sat in her apartment staring at the sealed envelope that had arrived far sooner than she expected. Her hands trembled as she opened it. One line stopped her breath. Sibling match. 99.9. Clara Cole and Keisha Brown are identical twins. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. "We got the same results. I need to see you." Ethan's mansion in Westchester glowed under soft evening light. When she arrived, Ellie ran to the door first. "Miss Keisha," she squealed. Daddy says you're Mommy's sister. Keisha knelt, smiling through tears. That makes me your aunt. The little girl wrapped her arms around her neck. Can I draw us all together? Ethan stood in the doorway, his usual calm cracked by emotion. She remembers Clara's favorite song. He said quietly. Keisha smiled faintly. Bluebells and lullabies? His eyes widened. How did you? I don't know, she whispered. Maybe it's a me too. They spent hours at the kitchen table, Ellie coloring, Ethan asking questions that barely hid the wonder in his tone. For the first time, Keisha felt seen, not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged to something bigger than pain. When she left that night, Ethan said, "You don't owe me anything, but you deserve answers." She nodded. "We both do." Behind them, Victoria watching the driveway shadows, expression unreadable, jealousy already taking root. Days later, Keisha arrived at the Cole mansion again, the fall air heavy with the scent of wet leaves. She could feel something off the moment she stepped inside. Ethan's voice echoed faintly from the study, firm, clipped, tense. She followed it to the doorway. Victoria Hale stood inside, arms crossed, posture perfect but eyes burning. "You're letting her move into Clara's shadow," Victoria hissed. "She's family," Ethan replied coldly, "and I won't apologize for giving her a place at this table." "Family," she snapped. "She's a stranger who just showed up with a sob story and matching cheekbones." Keisha froze. The sting of those words felt like ice. Victoria turned and spotted her in the doorway. "How convenient," she sneered. The ghost walks in. Ethan's tone dropped. "Enough." But Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You think this ends with hugs and photo albums? Look at her skin, Ethan. The board will eat you alive." That line hit harder than a slap. Keisha's voice cracked with anger. "Say it plain, Victoria. You mean because I'm black?" Silence stretched like a blade. Even Ethan looked stunned by how raw it sounded in the air. Victoria blinked, feigned composure, and said, "You're twisting my words." "No," Keisha said quietly. "You just didn't expect to hear them out loud." Ethan stepped forward. "Victoria, you're done here. Take a leave." "I built this company with you," she snapped. "And now you're tearing it apart," he said. "Get out." She turned sharply and stormed past Keisha, perfume trailing behind her like venom. But as she left, she whispered near Keisha's ear, low and cold, "You don't know who you're dealing with." That night, Keisha couldn't sleep. Something about that threat, that confidence, gnawed at her. She pulled out her old foster care documents again, papers she'd nearly memorized. But one name suddenly caught her eye. At the bottom of the no sibling contact authorized form, a signature, Margaret Hale. Her heart skipped. She searched the name on her phone. Old records popped up, a retired caseworker. And right beneath it, a photograph from a news article decades ago. Margaret Hale, standing next to her niece, Victoria. Keisha whispered, "It's her family. They did this." The next morning, she called Ethan. "I need to show you something." He met her in the office conference room. She placed the file on the table. "Your assistant's aunt handled my adoption case. She signed the paper that kept me from Clara." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're sure?" "Yes. It's the same handwriting, the same date." He leaned back slowly, realization dawning. All these years, Clara's life, our lives, controlled by the same people who kept you apart. Keisha nodded, eyes fierce. "She didn't just hate me. She's been protecting her aunt's lie." Ethan exhaled heavily. "Then we expose it, every piece of it." Outside the window, storm clouds rolled in, the kind that don't bring rain first, only warning. News doesn't whisper, it roars. By morning, every major outlet from New York to Toronto carried the same headline: twin sisters torn apart by corruption. Billionaire's family caught in decades-old racism scandal. Clips rolled across TV screens. Keisha's photo beside the late Clara Cole, their resemblance undeniable. Commentators debated morality, privilege, and power. But for once, Keisha didn't hide from the noise. She watched quietly from her small kitchen table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of her. Her phone buzzed nonstop, reporters, lawyers, strangers offering sympathy. Then came the text from Ethan, "We did the right thing. Don't read the comments." At the same moment, Victoria Hale sat alone in her penthouse office, the city skyline behind her. Her name had vanished from company directories overnight, security badges deactivated. The board had voted unanimously, terminated for misconduct and ethical breach. Her manicured fingers trembled around a half-empty glass of wine. She stared at her phone screen, a single message draft left unsent. "You ruined me." But she never pressed send. Back at Cole Industries, Ethan stood before the board. Cameras were banned. Voices were low. "This company has nothing to hide," he said, his tone calm but final. "My late wife was lied to. My family was manipulated. And we will not protect the people responsible." Someone asked if he feared reputational damage. Ethan looked out the window toward the gray Manhattan skyline. "The truth doesn't damage you," he said. "It frees you." When he left the room, reporters surrounded him, firing questions. He simply said, "Her name is Keisha Brown, and she's not a stranger. She's family." That evening, Keisha met him in Central Park, the same bench where Clara's memorial plaque now gleamed under the fading sun. "You sure about going public?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "Secrets killed Clara. Silence almost kept you hidden. No more." She smiled faintly. "Then this is justice." "Not revenge," he said. "Justice." The camera of life panned wider. A black woman and a white man standing side by side, not as symbols, but as survivors of truth. Ellie ran up between them, holding a drawing of 3 stick figures: Daddy, Mommy, Sister, and me. Keisha knelt, voice breaking with tenderness. She's starting to understand. Ethan smiled softly. She understands more than any of us. The wind lifted the drawing from Ellie's hand, carrying it upward until it caught against a tree branch, fluttering like a tiny flag of peace. For the first time in years, Keisha felt light, not because the world was fair, but because the truth was finally visible. And sometimes that's enough to start healing. The Hudson River shimmered under the pale light of dawn. Keisha stood alone at the small memorial garden, where Clara's name was carved into polished stone. A soft breeze lifted her hair as she placed fresh bluebells beneath the plaque, the same kind that had started everything. She whispered, "You were never lost, Clara. They just kept us apart." Her voice broke, but her hand stayed steady. For the first time, the silence felt peaceful, not hollow. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. Ethan approached, dressed simply, no bodyguards, no power in his posture, just a man who finally let go of guilt. Beside him walked Ellie, holding a candle in both hands. "Mommy always said bluebells meant forgiveness," Ellie said softly. Keisha smiled through tears. She was right. They knelt together, lighting the candle and setting it near the flowers. The flame flickered, bending with the wind, but never going out. Ethan looked at Keisha. "I used to think family was something you built. Now I know it's something you find, even when it's almost too late." Keisha nodded. Clara wanted peace, and we finally gave it to her. They stood in silence, watching the sunrise stretch across the water, gold light touching everything the darkness once owned. A quiet promise filled the air, one that didn't need to be spoken. They would protect Ellie's innocence, Clara's memory, and the truth that had set them free. Keisha turned toward the path leading out of the garden. She took one last look at the plaque and whispered, "Goodbye, sis, and thank you for guiding me home." CTA at end. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.